Are you one of those people who has really high expectations of yourself and then therefore also has really high expectations for everybody else around you? Do you find yourself constantly stressed and disappointed because those expectations aren't really ever met? Well, we're going to talk about it today on Boldly Different Conversations with Bree, especially since it's Valentine's week, the week of unmet expectations. So please join me. Okay, so expectations. What if we changed our expectations into preferences? What is the difference between expectation and preferences? And how is this actually going to help us, specifically as people who identify as like recovering people pleasers or someone who like wants outside approval, right? As love. Now we're all working on that, right? We're all working on that not being the case, not people pleasing, not receiving only external approval as love or value and worth for ourselves, right? But I think when we get to Valentine's Day and we get to holidays like this, it's so easy, one, to fall into other people's expectations and people please, and then also, and disappoint them. And then also have our own expectations and not even realize it. And I find, as someone who is a recovering people pleaser, that my expectations of myself and others are so much higher because, well, I would do it for them, is the thought process of this is how it should be. So that's how I'm doing it for them. Well, why are these people not doing it for me? And we get more disappointed, especially as people pleasers, when it comes to our expectations not being met. So something that I have been learning, and honestly, I've been trying to do this for many years, and I feel like I've kind of had a breakthrough in the last maybe 6 months, 4 months. And I'm still working on it. When it comes to expectations and reframing them to be preferences rather than expectations of myself and others, and finding myself in the disappointment, stressed cycle. So first, let's talk about what's the difference between an expectation and a preference. So an expectation is where it's shoulds, oughts, this is how it is, right? And there's not really a deviation allowed from that in our minds, okay? And if there is a deviation, there's a lot of disappointment. And sometimes expectations, not all expectations, but sometimes our expectations come with entitlements, where we feel entitled to something, we feel attached to something, and the outcome in a way that doesn't allow grace, it doesn't allow compassion for ourselves or others. And so that's where the problem comes in. Conversely, preferences is where we have the desire or the hope for a certain outcome. But with that, we also acknowledge and allow for there to be deviations, allow for there to be changes or the outcome to not necessarily meet exactly what we think it should look like. And for a people pleaser, this is difficult sometimes because when we are doing something for someone else's approval or love or acceptance for validation, we have it set in our minds, it has to look a certain way in order to get that thing, in order to get that approval. And we end up carrying that over for ourselves when people do things for us. And so with Valentine's Day, it can be a real problem, right? Because we think, oh, I'm going to go all out for this person. I'm going to make them feel special. I want to make them feel loved. You know, I do this all the time, but especially on Valentine's Day, I want them to feel loved, accepted, known, seen, etc. Right? Because, why? Because truly, we want it for ourselves. So people pleasing really is such a selfish thing because we do that because we want to receive the same thing and we become attached then to the outcome. And it's no longer just a preference or something we would like. It becomes an unhealthy expectation. Again, not all expectations are bad. And when we are talking about changing our expectations into preferences, this does not mean we're lowering our standards. This does not mean that we are accepting low standards from someone, a group, whatever. It just means that we are releasing the attachment that we have to an outcome of how we think things should look, how they ought to look. So what are the benefits of this? Why? Well, first, let's talk about how to do this. How do we shift from expectations to preferences? Something that I have been doing is, and I think is super important, is first to identify our expectations. We have to know where we have expectations in our life, either of a person, an organization, a situation. Like, what is our expectation of this, of ourselves and or the other party, right? So we have to identify them first. And I think an easy way to identify them is it's all about language in our minds and how we think about these things. So are we using, I think it's easy to identify it with oughts, shoulds, I expect. Those are like probably the key words that I find language-wise I'm using in my mind, and I may even communicate as to how I think something should go, or there should be a certain outcome. And this has helped me identify where I think there are expectations in my life of other people. And then what we have to do is we have to then challenge that expectation. We have to challenge it with some questions. And these 5 questions have really helped me to kind of reframe and challenge those expectations that I have. Because again, not all expectations are bad. And again, these are expectations that I have of others and expectations I have of myself, for others. The first question is where did this expectation come from? What is the root of it? What is it born out of? Is it born out of service? Is it born out of a distortion? Is it born out of, this is what I've just seen all my life? Is it born out of, what we see in society? Like, is it have to do with our own childhood? Like, where is this expectation coming from? I think is a key point, because oftentimes this will point us to whether or not is it a healthy expectation. If it came from our childhood and our childhood has some messiness to it, we might want to question that of why we have that expectation. And expectations can be either good or bad, positive or negative, right? Like specifically with Valentine's Day, is my expectation that they bring me roses and they treat me like, a princess and I am absolutely spoiled with all the things. Is that what my expectation is? Because that's how I'm going to receive love? Or is my expectation maybe the opposite because of the experience I've had in my life where I don't expect anything. I don't expect them to do anything. I expect them, in fact, to ignore it completely because, of XYZ reasons. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that is where, it's not always an expectation of this thing has to happen. It might be the opposite of we don't expect something to happen because of where that expectation is coming from and the experiences that we've had. The second question then is this expectation realistic and or reasonable? Is this something that really is reasonable for the situation, the person, the organization, whatever it is that we have an expectation of? And we cannot base it, especially for people pleasers, we cannot base it on what we would do for others. Because people pleasers were always prioritizing everybody else and what their needs and likes and preferences are, not what ours are necessarily. But in a sneaky way, we are, because we would be, we have this expectation of, I'm doing this for them. Why aren't they doing this for me? And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because we should expect, if there is good, we should expect care and love. We should expect those things because we deserve those things as humans for no other reason other than we're humans, right? Respect. Some of those expectations are just, it's okay. Those are reasonable. Those are realistic. But it's when we get into the realm of non-realistic, either for the situation, the person, their own capacity, their own wallet. Are they able to afford fancy dinners out and, jewelry and chocolates and the long stem roses because, the prices are insane for Valentine's Day. Like, is it realistic and reasonable of the situation of the person, etc.? And is it realistic and reasonable for us to do that thing for the other person? and to maintain it all the time? It's dual. It really is dual. It's a great question that we can ask ourselves. The third question that I ask myself is this expectation based on facts, or is it based on assumptions? Is it based on, am I assuming that this person is not going to do this thing? Am I assuming that they are going to do this thing for me on Valentine's Day or whatever it is? Or is it based on the facts, the evidence, or something they've actually said to us? Where is this expectation coming from? Not just having to do with Valentine's Day, but in all things in our life. Are we expecting someone to not follow through because they've shown us that they're not going to follow through on something? That's more factual. That's evidence-based. Or are we just assuming that they're not going to follow through because, someone else that we know never followed through? Where is this expectation coming from? Is it based on fact, or is it based on assumptions that we have? The fourth question is how does this expectation actually make me feel? How does having this expectation about the situation, the person, whatever it is, how does this make me feel? Does it make me feel anxious? Does it make me feel like it's never going to happen? Does it make me feel like if it doesn't happen, then life is over? That sounds dramatic, but there are things in my life that I've realized I had absolute expectations for. And if those things weren't met, I felt like adrift. I felt like I had no purpose in my life. I think this is so true, especially with those of us with kids. We have expectations for our children. And I found myself get caught up in, if my child doesn't perform in a certain way or do this certain thing, am I going to be devastated? There's a lot there, but it's a great question, a great inquiry for us to ask ourselves is, how does this make me feel? Do I feel confident? Do I feel calm, at peace? Or does it make me feel anxious? Is it making me feel negative in a negative way? And then the fifth question that we can ask ourselves then is this expectation serving me well? Or is it hurting me? How is this serving me? How is this expectation serving me? Is it hurting me? Is it making me anxious? Is it bringing a lot of strife in my relationships? Is it bringing strife within myself of how I think about myself? Am I able to have confidence in myself? Especially as a people pleaser. Am I expecting too much of myself to serve and prioritize other people, to do this thing for them so that I feel love? If it's not serving me, this expectation's not serving me, perhaps I need to reframe it as a preference. Okay, so first is identify, second is challenge, asking those questions. The third thing to help us reframe an expectation into more of a preference is actually reframing it, changing the language about how we think about something. So instead of saying in our minds, we think about this as my partner, my husband, my spouse, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, whomever that we might be relating to, especially over this Valentine's Day, who are we in a relationship with. I think they should know what I need and what my expectations are for Valentine's Day. They should know that I need flowers. They should know that I want to be spoiled. They should know these things. That's expectations. They should know that this is the right thing and what I want. Instead, we reframe it to be more flexible. So we change the language in our head once we identify, I'm thinking oughts, shoulds, etc. I would prefer, or I would prefer for my partner or my spouse or boyfriend to be more attuned to my needs, and I can communicate my needs, desires, and wants to them. That's the key, is that communication. Communication truly is a key factor in expectations being met, because oftentimes people don't know what the expectation is, right? And this is where expectation isn't bad. If we have laid out, hey, I expect you to do something special for Valentine's Day. I expect a card. I expect flowers. That will fill me. That will make me feel loved. There's nothing wrong with that. There is nothing wrong with that. When we have communicated very clearly what the expectation is, there's leeway for that. Now, we have to keep in mind, is this person capable of doing that? Are they capable? And also, I think this is really true. We've talked about expectations, preferences, when we're talking about kids. Like, we can tell our children, this is the expectation for you. When we have communicated it clearly, and we know that they are capable of doing that thing, right? Whatever it may be. If they don't meet that expectation, then they know what the consequence is, right? So their expectations aren't always bad. They're not bad. It's just when we have them in unhealthy ways and we're not communicating them and we're not being flexible. So there are many areas in our life that we need to shift our expectations into preferences. And with Valentine's Day coming up, communication is key. So it's Tuesday. You still have a few days. Make sure you are communicating to your person what it is you expect or what it is you would like, what your preference is for that day. Don't leave it up to them to just figure it out. Number 4, the fourth way we can reframe expectations into preferences is that we have to embrace flexibility. Brianna, you have to embrace flexibility. This is an area that has been a real challenge for me for most of my adult life. I'm getting better. I really am. But it's a control thing, like I want to control outcomes. I want to control things because it gives me safety. But what I'm really learning is that when I'm embracing flexibility, I'm actually keeping my mind and my emotions safer because I do have high expectations of myself and others. And so many of them are just not attainable for most people. I grew up with very high expectations of me. And so I have these really high expectations of myself. And that's a lot of healing that I'm going through personally. But I think that this is true for a lot of people, especially women. We tend to have very high expectations of ourselves and therefore of other people. And we are inflexible sometimes. Again, this is not about us lowering our standards to where we don't get what we need. Because I think that's a key point, is that we need to get what we need. We have needs. It's totally okay to have those needs. It's when we mix them with our preferences, and make them expectations. I don't need to have things for Valentine's Day from someone I might be in a relationship with. What I do need is care and love and knowing I'm special and knowing I'm thought of and knowing that my needs and desires matter, right? That's what it's really about. It's not about actually getting the flowers. It's knowing that we're seen and appreciated and loved, not just on Valentine's Day, all the other days, but it's really nice also on Valentine's Day to know that you're special, right? Am I wrong about this? Okay. And I think a way that we get more flexible is if we get curious, embrace curiosity. Like, okay, so if this doesn't happen, if he doesn't give me flowers, if he doesn't do the special thing on Valentine's Day, how am I going to feel special? How is he going to show me I'm special, right? So there's some things there, and there's some leeway there, flexibility there. And again, key point, it's really important for us to communicate the needs. Communicate that need that you need to feel special on Valentine's Day. You need to know that you're cared about, you're loved, you're appreciated. There is nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I think as people pleasers, that's where we have the problems, because we're not communicating because we're afraid. We're afraid of how that communication is going to be received. We're afraid of the disappointment, right? Because a lot of times people pleasers have had a lot of disappointments, and that's why we people please, because we try to keep ourselves safe from disappointment, right? Okay. So that's how we do it. That's how we reframe it. That's how we make our expectations into preferences. And what are the benefits? We kind of talked about this, already. I think the number one is that it reduces our stress and the pressure on ourselves and others that we're in relationship with. Specifically when we're talking about Valentine's Day, like if we have clearly communicated needs, wants, desires, and then we are just open to how those needs are going to be met, it takes the pressure off the entire situation, right? Okay. It also helps us improve our relationships, obviously, because we're not putting so many demands. and other people. And then we're not putting so many demands on ourselves either, as people pleasers, as people who receive validation from other people. We're not putting those demands on ourselves to perform and do all the things so that we receive love, right? Because we're communicating and we're being open, we're being vulnerable, and we're sharing our needs and desires with other people, right? And we're sharing those preferences. And then when maybe it doesn't happen exactly the way we want it to happen, we can be open and still appreciate the thing that the person is doing, especially on Valentine's Day. I think that another benefit is that we have more self-acceptance, we have more self-love, because we're not so focused, as people pleasers specifically, we're not so focused on everybody else's and prioritizing everybody else's needs and wants and desires. And then we can focus on our own and then communicate those things, and we'll know what our needs are. I think for me, that was such a big thing for so much of my adult life, is that I didn't even know what I wanted because I was afraid to communicate it. You know, it's like you knew subconsciously, but like you didn't know how to communicate it because it was this thing that just, I didn't love myself. I didn't know myself. I wasn't aware of my actual desires. And because I was so busy focusing on everybody else's. And so, you know, this is where that self-love comes in, self-acceptance. The self-acceptance piece too, going back to that, something that's really important to this is understanding that those flaws about ourselves, those needs, are not weaknesses, right? These are not weaknesses, they're needs. But those flaws that we do have, because we all have them, are what makes us, the flaws are our new fears, right? I've kind of been using that phrase a lot for myself because perfectionism, residuals from childhood and young adulthood into adulthood in the last few years even, and trying to break that perfectionism is embracing those flaws and seeing those flaws as what makes me me. And that's what makes me fierce. That's what makes me amazing, right? And the same is for you. Your flaws are what makes you fierce. It's what makes you you. And accepting those things allows us to move things from expectations into preferences, because they don't have to show up that way. We don't have to have that thing in order to have value for ourselves, right? In our worth, because we accept ourselves with all of our flaws. And then I think the last thing that's really important to remember of why this is such a benefit to move our expectations into preferences is that this allows us to have greater authenticity with others and receive others with greater authenticity where they're at. And so when we have greater authenticity, this allows us to speak more freely. This allows us to show our flaws. This allows us to be vulnerable because we feel safe. We feel safer sharing those things and having more confidence in ourselves because we have that self-acceptance. We have more confidence to communicate what our needs are. And this makes us more authentic of actually communicating what it is we need and or want. And so something that we have to remember that I think is really important when we're talking about moving our expectations into preferences and releasing ourselves from people pleasing is that it's an ongoing process. It's a journey, right? It's not something that's going to happen overnight. We need to be patient with ourselves. We have to give ourselves compassion and grace, and others compassion and grace, right? There's something to be said of someone who does not follow through consistently, someone who is not, or a situation or organization or whatever it is, if they are not meeting or hearing what you're saying when you're communicating, or they're ignoring it, or they're not showing you the appreciation that you need. They're not showing you the care, not showing you the love. Consistently, they're ignoring it because that's their preference or because they're so unawares. There is a difference there, right? But something we have to understand is that shifting ourselves from expectations to preferences for others and ourselves is a process. It is a journey in and of itself, and we're going to mess it up. We're going to have too high of expectations sometimes still. If that's our thing, if we have high expectations of others and ourselves, we're going to fall back into that very easily. We'll give ourselves grace. We start over. Remember, it's part of our journey. It's okay. And then also, I think, again, communication is key here. Communication is key. And so much of communication is not just the verbal, but a key point of communication is receiving it. Is this person comprehending what I'm saying? We can communicate all day long But if the person or situation or the organization that we're communicating these needs to, if they've not comprehended it, they don't truly understand what it is we are saying, then communication has failed. And that's been something I've had to face, and it's really difficult because you feel like you have communicated and communicated and communicated, and really it's not about what you're communicating or maybe even how you're communicating. It's just that they've not received it. And that's where we can't control, right? And we have to get rid of that expectation of them understanding exactly what we're saying. We've gone through how we check in. That's another talk for another time. How to make sure that there is comprehension. Maybe we'll revise that and bring that back up again. Okay, so your challenge. I have a challenge for you. Listen, Valentine's Day is coming. So we have some expectations, yeah, right? I mean, we all do. But let's turn them into preferences. But let's challenge ourselves. And here's some couple challenging questions for you. The first one is where am I, or where are you holding expectation in your life? Where are your expectations? Like, am I holding things loosely, or are there certain things that I'm holding really tightly? We all have them. So we just have to identify them. So where are you holding expectations really tightly? And what is one thing of those expectations that I'm willing to release, let go of, so that I can change it into a preference and be more curious about it and more open and flexible? Whereas one expectation, I can change it into a preference. And then the third question that I would ask you is that by doing this, how can this in a positive way, or maybe a negative way, how is this overall going to change a certain relationship, this expectation that I have? How is this going to help a certain relationship or all my relationships? Let's think about these things. Let's challenge ourselves to answer some of these questions, and let's see what happens. Now, it is Valentine's week. I hope you have a fantastic Valentine's Day on Friday. I hope you feel special and you feel loved by someone special. And have a great Tuesday.